I'm Danny DiCrescenzo for 88.7 FM WRHU. The Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice here at Hofstra is located in 203 Roosevelt Hall and is led by Director Dr. Jonathan Lightfoot and Associate Director Dr. Veronica Lippincott. The center wishes to celebrate its 7th anniversary and to welcome Dr. Kevin Kumashiro to Hofstra University as leader of the newly re-established School of Education today on Wednesday, March 13th, 2024, from 4:30 to 5:45 p.m. in the Student Center Theater. Here's my conversation with Dr. Kumashiro on his talk, Aloha Shirts, Hula, and Baseball, How Anxieties About and Cultural Technologies Toward Hawaii and Japan Helped Shape the U.S. Neo-Empire. Dr. Kumashiro, talk to me about your background as a scholar.
Yeah. Well, when I started out my career in education, I started out as a teacher. I went into the Peace Corps. I taught where I grew up, which is in Hawaii. And one of the first things that I grew interested in was trying to understand the larger context of education. And that's what took me to graduate school to kind of study what's the larger sort of system that education operates in. And it took me through a number of different areas that I found myself wanting to do research in. So I started by really focusing on the classroom level. How do we teach? How do we learn? And how do we prepare teachers to teach in ways that address the diverse student population that we're in, and also in ways that connect what we're learning to larger social problems in the world, like inequities and injustices. And that kind of inquiry in terms of what's happening in the classroom made me curious about what happens outside of the classroom. So I began to look much more at the policy world. What are the reforms coming down that makes it either helps what teachers are trying to do, or that makes it harder for teachers to succeed in reaching their students and sort of shaping minds and building up their capacity to flourish in life. And all along, I'm also going in and out of different kinds of institutions. So I've worked job-wise as a teacher and then as a professor and in administration. But I've also worked outside of higher education. I've worked with the Teachers Union in Washington, D.C. I worked as a consultant. And that has all this in and out eventually leads me to where I am right now, which is the interim dean of the School of Education, where I struggle with trying to bring together all of these things. Like, how do we build an institution that's having a direct and measurable impact in what's happening in schools locally and arguably around the world. And I think I guess it's a question I'm always trying to answer, right? No matter what role I'm in, is what's the contribution I can make to making this world a better place?
Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to answer that question right here. I don't think one little interview can bring us to that answer. It's a strong and deep question, requires a lot of deep thought, and certainly you've spent your very career thinking about it. If you're just tuning in to 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by the Interim Dean of Hofstra's School of Education, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. But I want to shift our focus to the lecture you'll be delivering today, titled Aloha Shirts, Hula, and Baseball, How Anxieties About and Cultural Technologies Towards Hawaii and Japan Helped Shape the U.S. Neo-Empire. Just for anyone who maybe just heard the title, give them your elevator pitch as to what you'll be discussing today.
Thanks so much for having me on your show, by the way, and allowing me to talk a little bit about this talk. It's, so much of my research has focused on like school reform and education policy and teacher preparation. And what I'm sharing tonight is actually my latest project that takes me in a slightly different direction. And it was inspired actually by trying to do some family history research. And, a lot of my family ancestors immigrated from Japan to Hawaii at either the late 1800s or early 1900s. And so as I'm studying the family history, I begin to study the kind of cultural and political history of what was happening in Hawaii and in Japan at that time. And that's where this all then sort of comes together, is I'm looking at, the title is Aloha Shirts, Hula, and Baseball. And it's because I start by looking at cultural phenomenon and how these kind of cultural attributes tell stories. They convey different stories about the US or about Hawaii or about Japan. And yet what's interesting is late 1800s, early 1900s, even up until maybe close to the mid 1900s, these three cultural things begin to overlap in some interesting ways that tell us a lot about struggles between nations and about empire building. So I think part of what I want to be talking about is how did I get into this project, but then also what was happening in Hawaii and Japan at this time, late 1800s, early 1900s, that can tell us a lot about what's happening even now in the US and around the world, around nation building, around empire building. And then, of course, since I'm an education scholar, I feel like I have to tie this all back to education. So the end part of my talk is, well, what does this all mean for schools? And in particular, what does it mean to build education in a way that strengthens democracy?
And just to go into that a little bit, some people may know the history at that time, well, late 1800s, early 1900s, American Empire, Spanish-American War on the Japanese historical side of things, Meiji Restoration, Russo-Japanese War, and then Hawaii by this point was a territory of the United States. So in terms of the historical context, how does that intersect with education for anyone who may not be as familiar with what's going on late 19th, early 20th centuries?
I'm super appreciating, by the way, all your historical references, which is so amazing.
I know a little bit. I know a little bit. I know a little bit.
That is great. Well, and so that's part of, I think, what I'm trying to get at is that we it's so hard to understand modern day struggles and modern day kind of politics without understanding how we got here. And so you're naming all these really, really important kind of historical events is part of the lesson. Like, I think we need to understand how we got here, but how it then connects to education. Part of what I'm trying to argue is that the way what is empire building? Empire building is about trying to dominate other spaces beyond your boundaries. And some of the ways that happens is through force and military and violence. Some of that is through the economy, but a lot of that happens culturally. A lot of that happens because we're shaping the ways people think about who we are, about who they are, about what our relationship is, about what the world could like or could look like or should look like. And that's sort of what I'm trying to get at with this talk is that the way that we exported ideas about the role of the US in the world, how the US is supposed to be relating to other people, how we want other people to view us, was not just forcefully and violently. It was also sort of subtly, insidiously, and culturally. And so understanding the stories that we're telling about things like what is baseball, what is hula, what is aloha shirts, is one of the strategies that we can see that any nation takes as it tries to build itself up and as it tries to change the relationships that it has with other people around the world. And so understanding narratives, cultural stories, myths, the legacies of different kinds of historical events, I think that's one of the ways that that's where education comes in, right? It's kind of education is getting us to question the commonsensical stories, what we take for granted that often goes unquestioned. I mean, I would say that, education isn't merely about getting us to buy into the stories everyone's already hearing. Education is about getting us to question the stories that we're hearing about who we are and who we could be, and asking us to imagine what are some other stories that we could be telling.
If you're just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by the Interim Dean of Hofstra's School of Education, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. In terms of that cultural imperialism lens, how does Hawaii become the intersection point of this trend you're trying to track? And you also mentioned before that this came out of family research. You talked about that as well?
So when I was looking into my family history, I was struck by how my family came in, arguably one of the earliest big waves of immigration that happened from Japan, but really from anywhere, to Hawaii. And it was partly fueled by what was happening between Hawaii and Japan. Just as you point to some of the dates, what was happening in the late 1800s was this is right after the overthrow, but right before the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. But right before the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, there were monarchs that were traveling around the world trying to say, maybe we could form coalitions to stop the United States from spread. At the time, what was happening in the late 1800s, the United States was acquiring territories all over its region, but arguably all over the world, right? It was spreading as an empire. It was conquering different lands and acquiring as territories. And Hawaii knew that this was coming. And so did people in Japan, and so did people in parts of Asia, and so did people in parts of South America and parts of Africa, right? And so part of what was happening was global conversations about how do we stop the spread of both European empires and American empires. And one of those narratives was, shouldn't we try to form coalitions? And one of the people pushing those narratives were monarchs from Hawaii, traveling around the world saying, look at what's happening. Do we want to try to organize to stop? And why I bring up this as an intersection of Hawaii and Japan is because this is also the moment of the rise of the Japanese Empire. This is post the restoration of the imperial family and sort of a move towards a different way of positioning Japan in the world. Japan, up until what 1860s, was considered, they considered themselves a closed nation. They weren't trying to have international relations with other countries. But when the emperor was restored, one of the reasons why they knew they had to build up international relations is because of the encroachment of the European and American empires into Asia. It had to sort of be more international in scope and build up alliances with other countries. But Japan took a slightly different turn really quickly. As it became an independent, sort of engaged nation, it actually emerged as a very powerful empire that would compete with the European and American empires. And so just to kind of tie back to the talk, one of the major arguments that I make is that empires often develop in response to perceived threats from outside. And so I'm going to point historically to how this has happened over the last kind of, century and a half, 2 centuries. I'm sorry, before the last millennium and a half to 2 millennium, right? For thousands of years, we can find examples of empires building in response to perceived threats from outside. And Japan would play this really central role as a threat that the United States and other countries would see as a threat. And so how the United States builds up its security apparatus, its security state, is largely in response, many would argue, to what it perceives as a threat from the East. And where that threat coincides is battles around Hawaii. And so it's interesting to then kind of look at how people were talking about the rise of the Japanese Empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and how that shaped not just US empire, it was shaping Germany, it was shaping the British Empire, it was shaping, right, other European empires that were spreading. A lot of conversations was about what they perceived as the threat coming from the East. And this Orientalism, this kind of threat from the East, what is often thought of as an Orientalist narrative, is what we see defining at least the narratives and ideologies that shape European empires for the last 2,000 years.
If you're just tuning into 88.7 FM WRHU, I'm Danny DiCrescenzo, joined by the interim dean of Hofstra's School of Education, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro.
So we have the context, we have the subject matter. I don't want to spoil anything else because this talk sounds like it's going to be excellent tonight. I just want to end off with, for somebody who may not have encountered this type of material, thinking about education this way, thinking about how cultures grow, interact, thinking about imperialism beyond the simple Army A marches into Territory B and annexes the land. What do you hope that students and those who attend take from your talk?
One of the main messages that I'm trying to convey is that we think about the stories that come through different kinds of cultural technologies. What are the narratives we're saying about who we are and who we're supposed to be in this world, or even what's possible? Those really big questions are interwoven through national identity, through cultural identity, and so on. So I do feel like thinking about the political power of narrative is one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with. And that's where I think I bring it back to education. When I think of education, I think a lot of people think about education as playing this role in terms of preparing people for jobs or preparing people to be competitive in the kind of economic workforce. And I think that's part of why we have education, but I would argue that's not even the main reason why we have education. Like, I would argue that education is about, education has the potential of kind of socializing us into the world as it is. And many people try to create educational structures that are all about socialization, and it often functions in that way. But I think education, and why education is often such a profound site of social struggle, is because many people know that education also has the potential to get people to tell a different story about who we are. It gets us to imagine not the world just as it is. In other words, let me say that a little bit differently. Education isn't merely about preparing us to fit in and succeed in the world as it is, as other people tell us it is. Education is all about building our capacity to imagine the world as it is not yet, and then to build towards that world if we so choose. And that has everything to do with the narratives that are available to us about who we are and who we can be. That to me is like the central democratizing function of education. And if I were to say, what's one of the major takeaways that I'm trying to get at, I would say that would be one of the major messages I hope people walk away with.
Dr. Kumashiro, it's going to be a great talk. Thank you so much for joining the morning show to preview it.
Thank you so much for having me.